here we have some redcoat soldiers from the American War of Independence. And here we have a redcoat drummer from the American War of Independence. And here we have some more redcoat drummers, and another redcoat drummer, and some more. Now hold on, you may be saying at this point, something doesn't seem very right here. Why is it that all of these British drummers from that war seem to be wearing uniforms which are so very different from those of their regimental counterparts? But before we can answer that question and discuss why the uniforms of musicians were so very different from those of the other parts of the army during the American War of Independence and the 18th century more on the whole, I think it's important to talk about the actual role of a musician in an army during that time period. Why did these regiments have drummers and fifers accompanying the regular soldiers? Surely these people would be more useful to the army carrying a musket and actually performing, military duties. And the role that they filled was primarily that of a sort of army radio. You see, before the days of radios, officers still needed to be able to communicate with their men in, the chaos of battle and just in general, in camp, on the march, all these different environments. They need to be able to communicate to a very large number of men in a quick, simple, and very clearly identifiable fashion. And it was the musicians who were able to fill this early role. Whenever the army is camped out somewhere, they are the ones who are able to call the assembly in the morning. They are the ones who are able to signal the sentries to come out and, change posts and everything. They are the ones who are able to signal reveille in the morning, which is something that I'm sure no soldier ever really appreciated, but it's an important duty to fill out. In camp, it seems like all aspects of life of the army, at least every official aspect of life, sort of revolves around those musicians as if they were some grand timepiece keeping track of the daily motions. On the march, of course, it's a musician which will set the pace, although it is true that, at least in the Napoleonic Wars, I don't know if this was the case in the American War of Independence, I suspect that it might be, but it's definitely the case in the Napoleonic Wars that soldiers would be trained to march in time and carry out all of their motions and such, without the aid of a drummer. They were trained to sort of get that timing in their head, and then they were allowed to do it with a drummer. But a drummer certainly helps, if nothing else, to set that pace. And as well, I should imagine that a drummer and a fifer can provide some level of entertainment on the march, perhaps not for a very long march, or not perhaps for the entire way, but at least for some of it, strike up a tune, and it can be some level of relief to an army just staring forward at the boots in front of them all day. And related to that, of course, we have on parade. Musicians serve a very important role, and indeed it was on parade that the role of the army musician was sort of most fully realized, if you will, in that they were able to play, marches and parade songs for whatever, ceremonial task that the army was performing that day, perhaps receiving a new set of colors, or passing in review in front of some officer or major, or whoever is observing them that day. But of course, the most famous, if you will, role of a musician would be on the field of battle. And no, they weren't just playing pretty little tunes in front of the army as they were marching out in front of the enemy to raise up spirits or some such. I can't imagine something like that would raise spirits all too highly. Indeed, the musicians, usually behind the line, would be the ones who were able to signal various commands to the army. If you think about in being such a massive field of battle with, the chaos and din of war all around you, you're not always going to be able to hear that one officer or NCO shouting in your ear to prime and load, or, make ready, present, or to advance, to retreat, all these different things. There was, for every little thing that a soldier would have to do in the field, be it to advance at various times, be it to retreat, be it to fix bayonets, be it to present and fire, every one of those little commands had a drum signal associated with it, some sort of, call that was very distinct from all the other ones, that a soldier would be able to hear that drum and realize, oh, that's it, that's us, where we have to advance. It's sort of another way, alongside, the officers and the NCOs shouting at you, it's just sort of another line of defense to make sure that all of your men hear the words of command and, receive that call, for example, to go forward, or indeed to retreat or anything else. So the duties performed by army musicians during this time period were very important to the overall managing and functioning of an army, both on the field of battle and off the field of battle. They were, again, sort of the clock chimes around which the workday of the army was arranged. They are the ones who were able to send messages to a vast number of men in a very simple, very quick, and very efficient manner, in a similar fashion to how, various flags were used on Navy ships. If you need to signal from one ship to another, you just hoist a number of flags up to the I'm not going to try and know the naval term would be, but you hoist a number of flags up, the people on the other ship can look over and say, oh, okay, it's, red, green, and blue, or whatever. Those three flags mean this particular action. Musicians serve the same sort of role in simply, over a shorter span of distance in the army. They're the ones who are communicating from officers to the men and from unit to unit. And it's because of this important role that most regiments would have one fifer and one drummer to accompany them and, help perform these tasks. What does this all mean for the uniforms of musicians during the war? And again, why are they so very different from the soldiers which they were drumming for? Well, I think it's important, first of all, to keep in mind that a musician is a different kind of soldier, and a different kind of soldier usually dictates, or is designated, a different kind of uniform. And during the 18th century in particular, rank is a difficult thing to sort of send across in uniforms. There is no, at least in the American War of Independence, there is no single system of, oh, yes, this man has 2 chevrons on his arm, therefore he's X or Y. Oh, this man has the 3 chevrons and a star, therefore he's this. It's not so organized as the modern military is, or indeed as the military was in the Napoleonic Wars, when we start to see things like chevrons to distinguish rank. Rather, you can always tell if someone's more important than you if they look more expensive than you, and it's a very simplistic way to put it, but I think that is a pretty good measure. If you're a private soldier, your uniform is going to look far simpler than that of the major. The major is going to have a lot more gold on his coat. He's going to probably have some nice white gloves. He's going to have a red sash, and he's going to be carrying a sword. Most importantly, of course, he won't be carrying a cartridge box. Corporals would have shoulder cords. Sergeants might carry hangers, infantry hangers, sort of sword that the infantry could use, although they were never really used in combat. Why use the hanger when you could use the bayonet? And indeed, as my sergeant in the reenacting community always complains to me, he hates lugging the thing around. It's so pointless, but it's a mark of rank. It's a way to look at that person and be like, oh look, red sash, sword, he's more important than I am, I'd better salute him as he goes by. And of course, it wouldn't be so simple in the mind of a soldier back in the day. They would know very well the distinguishing marks between the different ranks. But feeding into all of that, the musicians, because they are a different kind of soldier, and they serve a very different and a very important role to the army when compared to the rest of the soldiery, it sort of makes sense that they have a very distinguished, a very, different style of uniform, that you can, from across a field, immediately look and say, all right, that's the regimental musician, because look at how differently dressed they are from the rest of the regiment that they are not commanding, but sort of helping to facilitate the commands for. And of course, an officer being able to very readily identify where the musicians are and who they are, that might be very important as well on a field of battle. They are always going to be distinguished from the mass of men which they are marching alongside. And finally, after all of that, we come to the 1768 Royal Clothing Warrant, which effectively is an order from the king, and from the king's administrators, who probably wrote the whole thing, how that sort of thing usually goes, but from the king to the army saying, this is how I want my soldiers and my regiment to dress. This is how the officers are going to dress their men. So it details, it's actually a very interesting piece, I'll be sure to link it down below if you want to give it a read-through. It details the colors and the facings of regimental coats. It details the sorts of caps that people are going to wear. It dictates, who's going to wear bearskin and who not. It's going to dictate who's going to wear infantry hangers and all these different things. And in the 1768 Royal Clothing Warrant, of course, we have a section dedicated to musicians, as to how musicians are going to be addressed, which oftentimes, as you will see, is reliant directly on the colors of the regiment which they are associated with. So, finally, off to the words of the 1768 Royal Clothing Warrant, which set the uniforms of the British Army during the American War of Independence. Drummers' and fifers' coats.
The coats of the drummers and fifers of all the royal regiments are to be red, faced and lapelled with blue, and laced with royal lace. The waistcoats, breeches, and lining of the coats to be of the same colour as that which is ordered for their respective regiments. The coats of the drummers and fifers of those regiments which are faced with red are to be white, faced, lapelled, and lined with red waistcoats and breeches. Those of all the other regiments are to be the colour of the facing of their regiments, faced and lapelled with red. The waistcoats, breeches, and lining of those which have buff or white coats are to be red. Those of all the others are to be of the same colour as that which is ordered for the men. To be laced in such manner as the colonel shall think fit, the lace to be of the colour of that of the soldiers' coats, the coats have no hanging sleeves behind. And for the drummers and fifers' caps, the drummers and fifers to have black bearskin caps, on the front the king's crest of silver-plated metal on a black ground, with trophies of colours and drums. The number of the regiment on the back part, as also the badge, if entitled to any, as ordered for the grenadiers. So as you can see, for the majority of regiments, the uniforms of the musicians would have effectively been a reversal of that of the regiment they were with. If the regiment has X color facings and Y color coat, the musicians would have Y color facings and X color coat. However, when it comes to very particular regiments, royal regiments, such as, for example, the 23rd Royal Welsh Fusiliers, our drummer does not have a reversed coat like that, or those of any sort of regiment with a very particular kind of coat would have very different style of uniforms for their musicians. So the uniform of every different musician varies a great deal depending on what particular regiment they are associated with. There is no one singular formula for a uniform for a musician during this time period. It all depends on the particular regiment.
So as you can see from all of this, not only their role in the field, but the distinguishing marks which they were given, significantly more money, I imagine, is spent on a musician's uniform than that of a regimental soldier, given how much more detailed they are, and of course given bearskin caps for quite a few of them. They're quite valuable things to the army. They're very important and central to the functioning of the armed forces. So why is it that it seems so many of them were so incredibly young? It seems like an awful lot of responsibility to be passing off to a mere child. But that in and of itself may well be another misconception. Just how old was the average musician? How old was the little drummer boy during this time period? And I think that'll be a good topic for another day. But until that time, my dear viewer, I am and I shall remain your most humble and obedient of servants.